Elias Thorne was a man of the earth, hard, quiet, and unyielding. But he noticed things others missed. He noticed the slight, almost imperceptible limp his maid, Maria, tried so hard to hide. It wasn't just a wound. It was a story she refused to tell. One evening, driven by a nameless instinct, he followed her shadow out past the edge of his ranch. The truth he uncovered there, hidden from the world, was a burden so profound it would later make Sheriff Blackwood himself a man forged in iron question the very meaning of justice. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Elias Thorne did not speak the language of men. He spoke the language of the earth. He spoke in the silent rhythm of a hammer striking a post, in the straight, unyielding line of a newly mended fence that stretched toward a horizon bleeding into an endless sky. The sun had baked the silence into his skin, and the wind had chiseled patience into the lines around his eyes. His hands, calloused and mapped with the story of 100 seasons, knew the heft of an axe, the pull of rains, the subtle shift in the soil that foretold a dry spell. He was a man who noticed things. He noticed the way a hawk circled on an unseen current before a storm rolled in, the faint tremor in the ground that meant a herd was moving miles away, the specific wear on a horse's shoe that spoke of a loose stone on the western trail. His world was one of quiet, constant observation, a world where the loudest truths were the ones never spoken. And that is why he noticed Maria. She moved through his house like a ghost, a whisper of faded calico and quiet duty. She was good at her work, her hands always busy, her presence meant to be felt but not seen. But Elias saw. He saw the slight drag of her left foot, a hesitation so brief it was almost a trick of the light. He saw the way she would brace herself against a doorframe for a fleeting second, when she thought no one was looking, her jaw tight, a shadow of pain passing over her face before being locked away again behind a mask of weary composure. It wasn't the limp itself that held him. It was the hiding of it. It was a secret she carried in the very rhythm of her steps. He had seen men limp from broken bones, from old war wounds, from a lifetime of hard riding. Their limps were declarations, stories told openly with every step. Hers was a plea for invisibility, a truth she was trying to outrun. One afternoon, a ceramic plate slipped from her grasp, shattering on the stone floor. He had expected a cry, a curse, but there was only a sharp intake of breath, a flinch that was not about the broken plate, but about the sudden, unguarded movement that had sent a fresh spike of pain through her. She knelt to pick up the pieces, her face turned from him, but he saw the tremble in her shoulders. The silence in the house grew heavier after that. It was no longer a peaceful silence, the kind he was used to. It was a silence filled with an unspoken question, a deep and unsettling current of suffering that flowed just beneath the surface of his quiet life. Who was this woman? What wound did she carry that was so much deeper than flesh and bone? The mystery of it settled into him like a burr, a persistent irritation under his saddle, and he knew, with the same certainty that he knew the coming of winter, that he could not ignore it for long. The gnawing concern in Elias's gut became an undeniable pull, a current as strong and silent as the river that cut through the south pasture. It was the same instinct that told him when a calf was about to be born, or when a frost was coming to bite the crops. For days, he had watched Maria, the question of her limp an unspoken word on the air between them. Then, one evening, as the sun surrendered its final hold on the sky, bleeding fiery orange and deep purple across the vast plains, he saw her. She slipped out of the small bunkhouse, not with the hurried gait of a thief, but with the quiet determination of a pilgrim. She carried a small bundle and moved toward the fading light, her small frame swallowed almost instantly by the growing twilight. He did not think. He did not weigh the consequences. He simply moved. Elias followed, his own large frame a stark contrast to hers, a shadow tracking a shadow. The familiar landscape of his ranch, a place he knew better than his own reflection, began to transform around him. Under the weak light of a rising moon, the gentle, rolling hills looked like sleeping giants, their backs hunched against the night. The cottonwood trees, usually a source of shade and comfort, now clawed at the sky with skeletal fingers, their rustling leaves whispering warnings he couldn't decipher. Every snap of a twig under his worn boots sounded like a gunshot in the immense quiet. Every hoot of a distant owl felt like a judgment. He kept a careful distance, using the terrain for cover, his senses honed by a lifetime of tracking game. But he was not tracking a deer or a coyote. He was tracking a woman's pain, and the unfamiliarity of the hunt set his teeth on edge. Her limp, more pronounced now that she thought she was alone, was a painful, rhythmic meter counting out the steps toward a hidden truth. What secret could drive a person to walk this far into the unforgiving dark? Was she meeting a lover? Fleeing a debt? Walking into a trap? The questions circled in his mind like vultures over a kill. He tasted dust and apprehension. He felt the cold seep of the night air into his bones, a coldness that had little to do with the temperature. The world he knew, the world of fences and livestock and predictable seasons, was falling away behind him with every silent step. Ahead, there was only Maria's determined, limping silhouette, a small, lonely figure pushing against a vast and threatening darkness, pulling him deeper and deeper into a story he was never meant to be a part of. He followed until she veered from the open plains, disappearing into the jagged maw of an old, dry creek bed, a scar on the face of the land, as if she were being swallowed whole by the earth itself. He moved into the ravine's embrace like a man stepping into a grave. The air grew cold and still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The moonlight could not penetrate this deep, and he was forced to rely on instinct, his hand tracing the rough, crumbling wall of the creek bed. His mind, a place usually occupied by thoughts of rainfall and cattle prices, was now a canvas for dark speculation. A clandestine meeting with an outlaw, a hidden cache of stolen goods, a danger he was walking blindly toward. Then he saw it not the bright, bold flame of a traveler's campfire, but a faint, trembling flicker of light, a fragile pulse in the absolute dark. He moved slow, one rock at a time. The sound of his own breathing was a roar in his ears. Peering over a final rocky outcrop, the world he thought he knew fractured and fell away. There was Maria. She was on her knees before a meager fire, her back to him, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. But she was not alone. It was not a lover's rendezvous. It was a vigil. She was tending to a small form, a bundle of thin, worn blankets nestled in a hollow scraped from the earth, sheltered by a crude lean-to of dead branches and a tattered piece of canvas. As she leaned forward to dip a rag into a tin cup of water, the firelight illuminated the face within the blankets. A child. A boy no older than 5, his face pale except for a fever-bright flush high on his cheeks, his small chest rising and falling with a breath that was a fragile, ragged whisper. Her movements were a sacrament of desperation and love, her hand impossibly gentle as she wiped the boy's brow. And in that instant, the mystery of her limp was solved, not as a clue, but as a confession. It was not a wound of the flesh, but a wound of circumstance. It was the ache of 100 secret journeys into this cold, hidden place. It was the weight of the water, the food, the extra blanket she carried. Each painful step he had witnessed was a prayer for the small life hidden from the world, a testament to a mother's will to shield her son from a threat so great that this desolate ravine was the only sanctuary she could find. Elias remained frozen, a stone figure in the darkness, the cold of the night nothing compared to the chill that washed over him. He was a trespasser on the most sacred ground. There was the ferocious, heartbreaking circle of a mother's love. He had followed a shadow expecting to find a secret, and instead, he had found a soul. Without a sound, he backed away, the darkness swallowing him once more. But this time he carried the weight of her secret with him. The walk back to his ranch was a journey through a foreign land, though he had trod that same earth 1,000 times. The familiar chirr of crickets sounded like accusations, and the moon, once a simple lantern in the sky, now seemed like a cold, indifferent eye watching him carry a secret that was not his own. The image of the child, the feverish sheen on his small face, the fragile birdcage of his chest was seared into Elias's mind. He had spent a lifetime building fences, drawing lines between what was his and what was not. His land, his cattle, his quiet, orderly life. Maria and her son were not his. Their trouble, whatever it was a storm on a distant horizon, and every instinct he had cultivated for survival told him to stay inside, bolt the door, and wait for it to pass. He spent the night staring into the darkness of his own room, but seeing only the flickering firelight of the ravine. To interfere was to invite chaos. It was to take a stranger's burden and tie it to his own back, a weight that could drag him down into a mire of unknown dangers. Yet to do nothing, to know of that child shivering in the cold earth and turn his back, felt like a kind of spiritual rot. It felt like letting a vital piece of his own humanity wither and die on the vine. It was a betrayal not of Maria, but of the silent, unyielding code he lived by, a code that demanded a man protect the helpless, whether they were his or not. When the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the sky, the darkness in his mind receded with the night. The decision had been made in the silent hours, not in a flash of clarity, but in a slow, grinding shift of his soul. He rose and moved with purpose. From a dusty medical chest, he took a dark bottle of quinine, its bitter scent sharp in the morning air. He pulled a thick woolen blanket from his own bedroll, a heavy, solid thing that held the memory of warmth. From the pantry he gathered smoked ham, a small sack of flour, and a jar of honey. He packed it all into a sturdy wooden crate, each item a word in a sentence he could not speak. He carried the crate, its weight a comfort, a tangible manifestation of his choice. He did not go to the ravine that was her sanctuary, and he would not trespass again. Instead, he placed it on the faint trail she used, beside a gnarled juniper tree, an offering left for fate. Then he retreated to a rocky bluff overlooking the path, a lone sentinel watching and waiting. Hours later, he saw her. She moved with that same weary, determined rhythm. She stopped short when she saw the crate, her body instantly rigid with suspicion. She scanned the horizon, her fear a palpable thing even from a distance. Slowly, cautiously, she approached. She nudged it with her foot before finally, hesitantly, prying open the lid. Elias watched as her posture changed. Her shoulders, held so tight with a tension that must have been agony, suddenly slumped. She sank to her knees, one hand covering her mouth, her body shaking in a silent, violent wave of relief. It was the quiet collapse of a dam that had been holding back an ocean of despair. And from his perch on the rock, Elias Thorne felt the first crack in the wall he had built around his own heart. A new silence settled over the ranch, different from the one that came before. The old silence had been a void, an emptiness defined by unspoken questions. This new silence was a space filled with a shared, unspoken truth. It was a bridge built between two solitary people, constructed not of words, but of actions that carried the weight of psalms. Maria moved through the house with a changed spirit. The deep, hunted fear in her eyes had not vanished, but it had receded, like a tide pulling back just enough to reveal a sliver of shore. She still did not speak of the ravine, of the child, of the life she kept hidden in the shadows. But when her path crossed Elias's, her gaze would meet his for a fleeting second, and in that moment, a world of gratitude was exchanged. Her limp remained, a constant, painful reminder of her burden, but now she walked with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew she was no longer entirely alone. Her survival was no longer a solitary battle waged against the world. An alliance had been forged in the pre-dawn darkness, sealed not with a handshake, but with a crate of medicine and a mother's silent tears. Elias, for his part, fell into a new rhythm. Every third day, he would pack the wooden crate. His choices were deliberate, a silent conversation about her needs. One week, it was a warm jar of broth and a fresh loaf of bread. The next, a small bottle of cough syrup and a pair of child-sized woolen socks he'd bought in town, the purchase a quiet act of rebellion against his own isolation. He would leave the offering by the juniper tree and return hours later to find the crate empty. Then, one day, it was not empty. Resting on the bottom was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its head cocked as if listening to a secret song, its tiny wings seeming to hold the very promise of flight. He picked it up, the smooth, polished wood warm in his calloused palm. It was a thing of impossible delicacy, a piece of beauty carved from a life of hardship. It was her voice. It was her thank you. From then on, their silent correspondence continued. He would leave flour and salt. He would find a perfectly rendered wooden flower, its petals curled as if in greeting to the Sunday. He left a bag of apples. He found a smooth, gray river stone polished until it shone like a captured piece of the moon. They were two lonely islands that had, through a current of shared humanity, found a way to send messages across the water. A fragile peace settled over the land, a brief, golden season of hope. The threat that had driven her into the ravine felt distant, a low rumble of thunder on a far-off horizon. In this quiet interlude, there was only the steady rhythm of work, the silent exchange of gifts, and the growing, unspoken bond between a man who had forgotten how to speak and a woman who could not afford to. He did not know her story, and she did not know his. But they knew each other's heart. Peace is a fragile thing, a delicate desert flower that blooms in the brief space between storms. And the storm that arrived in Redemption Gulch wore a tailored coat and a disarming smile. His name was Jedediah Kane, and he did not ride into town like a man passing through. He rode a magnificent black stallion with silver inlaid tack, and he moved with an air of absolute ownership, as if the dusty street and the weathered buildings were mere entries in a ledger book he owned. He was not a man of the earth. He was a man of paper and ink, of contracts and consequences. His charm was a well-honed tool, a sharp blade hidden within a velvet sheath. He bought a round of drinks at the saloon, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that cut through the rough-hewn noise. He asked questions. Simple questions, delivered with a friendly tilt of his head. "I'm looking for a woman," he'd say, his eyes scanning the faces of the patrons, weighing and measuring them. "Dark hair, answers to Maria. She has a responsibility to me, a debt. She's traveling with a small boy, my boy." He said the words "my boy" with a chilling finality, as if speaking of a stray head of cattle to be reclaimed. The words spread through the town like a fever, a dark whisper carried on the wind. Elias heard it when he went to the mercantile for salt and flour. He saw Kane from across the street, a stark, dark figure of unsettling civility in a town built on grit. An instinct, cold and sharp, went through him. This was the threat. This was the reason for the ravine, for the fever, for the fear that lived in Maria's eyes. When he returned to the ranch, the very air felt different, charged with a new and terrible electricity. He found Maria in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot with a frantic energy. She did not need to be told. She had felt his presence, a shift in the world that only the hunted can sense. She looked up as he entered, and her face was a canvas of pure terror. The color had drained from her skin, leaving it a waxy, translucent white. Her hands, usually so capable, trembled so violently that the pot slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor with a deafening bang. She didn't flinch. She just stared at Elias, her eyes wide, black pools of a despair so profound it stole the breath from his own lungs. In her gaze, he saw the full story, the cruelty masked by Kane's charm, the suffocating weight of the debt he spoke of, the reason she would choose a cold ravine over a warm bed. The fragile peace had not just been broken, it had been shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. A long, cold shadow had fallen across his land, and its name was Kane. The sight of Maria's terror was a branding iron to Elias's soul. The quiet pact of the juniper tree, the silent exchange of gifts, all of it was children's play against the harsh reality that now stood in the center of town. Jedediah Kane was not a distant threat. He was a hunter who had scented his prey, and he was closing in for the kill. The time for leaving offerings in the dark was over. Leaving food and medicine was an act of charity. But this required an act of war. All his life, Elias had built fences to keep the world out, to define the edges of his responsibility. Now, standing in the doorway of his own quiet home, he felt those fences splintering and collapsing inside him. The moral dilemma that had simmered beneath the surface had boiled over into a stark, undeniable choice. He could send her away, wash his hands of it, and return to his solitary peace, knowing he was sentencing a woman and her child to a fate worse than any winter storm. Or he could open his door, invite the hurricane inside, and stand against it. He was not a hero. He was a rancher, a quiet man of the earth. But in that moment, looking at the memory of Maria's shattered face, he understood that sometimes a man doesn't get to choose what he is. He only gets to choose what he does. He moved without another thought, his decision a cold, hard stone in his gut. He strode out into the dying light, his long shadow stretching before him as he made his way back to the ravine. This was not the stealthy, uncertain journey of a spy. This was the determined march of a man who had drawn a line in the dust with his own soul. He found her packing her meager belongings in a frantic haste, her hands shaking, her eyes darting toward the mouth of the ravine as if expecting Cain to appear at any moment. The boy, looking stronger but still terribly frail, watched her with wide, confused eyes. When Maria saw Elias, she flinched, a small, wounded animal cornered and expecting the final blow. He stopped a few feet from her, letting the space between them hold the weight of his intention. He did not speak of Cain. He did not speak of the danger. He simply looked at her, then at the child, and held out his hand. A simple, calloused hand offered against the encroaching darkness. "Come with me," he said, his voice a low rumble, not a request but a statement of fact. "You're not safe here." Tears streamed down Maria's face, silent trails on her dusty cheeks. It was the breaking of the final dam of her fear, her pride, her desperate solitude. She nodded. A single, sharp movement. Elias gently lifted the boy into his arms, the child's small weight a profound and terrible responsibility. He led the way out of the darkness of the ravine and into the twilight, Maria following close behind. He had crossed the line. He had taken her story and made it his own. The storm was no longer on the horizon. He was carrying it home. The hoofbeats arrived with the setting sun, a sound that did not belong to the land. It was not the familiar, weary tread of a lone horse returning to the barn after a long day, but the sharp, confident, and invasive rhythm of an assault. It was the sound of metal striking hard-packed earth, a sound of ownership and finality that tore the fragile peace of the twilight to shreds. 3 riders. Elias had already seen them crest the distant ridge, 3 dark shapes silhouetted against a bruised purple sky, a cancerous growth on the clean line of the horizon. He had moved without a word, a lifetime of instinct taking over. He guided Maria and her son deep within the house, into the small back room where the shadows were longest and the walls were thickest, a silent promise of protection in the gesture. He stood now in the open doorway of his home, his large frame, a silent, unmoving testament to his decision, his hand resting on the rough-hewn wood of the doorframe as if drawing strength from the very house he had built. The small sanctuary of lamplight and warmth was at his back. Before him lay the encroaching darkness and Jedediah Cain. Cain dismounted with an unnerving, fluid elegance, his polished boots making no sound in the thick dust, as if he were too refined to be touched by the grit of the world. The 2 men who flanked him were a different breed entirely. They were not men, but tools, their faces blank and hard, their bodies radiating a coiled, indifferent violence. They did not look at Elias with curiosity, but with a cold, professional assessment, their hands hovering near their holsters like resting predators waiting for a command. Cain stopped 10 feet from the porch, a folded paper held loosely in his gloved hand. He smiled, and the expression held no warmth, only the cold, metallic glint of ownership. "Mr. Thorne?" His voice was calm, almost conversational, a chilling sound in the tense quiet that felt more threatening than any shout. "A simple misunderstanding, I'm sure. You appear to be harboring my property." He did not look past Elias. He did not acknowledge the existence of the woman he was hunting. He spoke only to the obstacle. Elias remained silent. His silence was not an absence of words. It was a physical presence. It was a wall built of resolve, a mountain of refusal. He did not move. He did not blink. From deep inside the house, a tiny whimper was instantly muffled, the sound of a child's fear, a sharp, painful sting in the air. Cain's smile tightened at the sound, the mask of civility slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the predator beneath. "I have a contract," he continued, tapping the paper against his glove, the sound a small, crisp punctuation in the heavy silence. "A legal binding document that states the woman, Maria, is indentured to me until her family's debt is paid in full. The child is an extension of that contract. This is a matter for the law, not for ranch hands playing at heroics." He took a single step forward, a deliberate, challenging motion. The 2 men behind him shifted their weight in unison. The battle had begun, not with fists or bullets, but with a gaze. It was the cold, legalistic greed in Cain's eyes against the unwavering, grounded decency in Elias's. It was a world of paper and ownership crashing against a world of earth and humanity, and the doorway of this small, lonely ranch had become the battlefield for a woman's soul. The tense tableau was broken by a fourth rider, one who moved with the slow, deliberate weight of authority. Sheriff Blackwood did not hurry. His horse, a sturdy gray gelding, seemed to understand the gravity of its master's purpose. Blackwood was a man carved from the same hard earth as Elias, but where Elias was shaped by seasons, Blackwood had been forged by statutes. He was the law, simple and unadorned, his face a mask of stern neutrality, his eyes missing nothing. He dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the scene Cain's smug confidence, the coiled readiness of his men, and Elias, standing like an ancient oak in the doorway of his home. Cain. Blackwood's voice was flat, a sound like gravel being sifted. This is a private matter. Cain stepped forward, all polite reason, and held out the folded paper. Sheriff, just collecting my property. A simple indenture agreement, signed and witnessed, all perfectly legal. Blackwood took the document. The air grew thick with the silent screams of injustice as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the elegant, looping script. It was all there, in black and white, the language of bondage, wrapped in the respectable cloak of legality. A debt, a term of service, a life signed away with a desperate scrawl. The law was on Cain's side. The sheriff's duty was a straight, clear line. He was meant to enforce the paper in his hand, to uphold the contract, to hand the woman and child over. The armor of his duty was heavy, impenetrable. He looked at Elias, expecting an argument, a denial, a plea, but Elias Thorne did not speak of the law. He did not speak of rights or contracts. His gaze was fixed on the sheriff, and his voice was low, rough, with a profound and unshakable certainty. He was sick, Elias said, the words dropping like stones into a silent well. Just a boy. The simple sentence cut through the legal jargon, through the pretense of civility, and struck at something deeper. It was a plea not to the lawman, but to the man. Blackwood's gaze lifted from the paper, past the cold smirk on Cain's face, past Elias's stoic defense, and into the shadowed depths of the house. For a moment, he saw her. Maria was standing in the hallway, no longer hiding, her son clutched to her chest, his small face peeking out from the folds of her dress. She was not property. She was a mother, her body a shield, her eyes a terrifying mix of defiance and despair. The sheriff looked back down at the paper in his hand. The ink seemed to mock him, the elegant script a web of lies. It was a piece of paper, a promise made in fear. And what was that, he wondered, when weighed against the trembling, breathing life of the child in that doorway? The straight, clear line of his duty had suddenly become a fractured, impossible path. The paper in his hand was the law, but the truth was standing right in front of him, in the space of a single, drawn-out heartbeat, a lifetime of decisions, of statutes memorized and duties fulfilled, weighed upon Sheriff Blackwood. The paper in his hand felt impossibly heavy, not with the simple weight of ink and pulp, but with the chilling, absolute authority of a world he had sworn his life to uphold. It was the law, cold, precise, and utterly blind to the nuances of a human heart. He could feel Jedediah Cain's smug certainty radiating from him like heat from a blacksmith's forge, the quiet, predatory confidence of a man who knew the rules of the game and had played his winning hand perfectly. The ink was dry. The signature was there. The matter was, by all accounts, closed. But then, Elias Thorne's words echoed in the vast, silent cavern of his mind, a simple phrase that possessed more power than any legal document. Just a boy. It was a truth that bypassed the brain and went straight to the soul. The sheriff moved slowly, his actions deliberate, as if moving through deep water. He folded the contract. He did not tear it or cast it to the ground. He simply folded it in half, then in half again, a quiet, methodical act of dismissal that was more final, more profound than any drawn weapon. He looked at Cain, and for the first time that night, his eyes were not the neutral, assessing eyes of a lawman, but the hard, knowing eyes of a man who had been forced to look into the very soul of a thing and render a judgment that no book could provide. A contract signed under threat, Blackwood stated, his voice devoid of any warmth, a flat, hard sound against the night. a term of service that amounts to little more than slavery. It has no standing here. This is my county, Cain. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over the other man. And in my county, a piece of paper does not outweigh a human life. Cain's smile finally broke, crumbling like sun-baked earth to reveal the raw, ugly greed beneath. You can't, he started, his voice a strangled hiss of disbelief. But Blackwood raised a single, silencing hand. I can. Now, you and your men will ride out, and you will not look back. There was no room for argument. The authority in Blackwood's voice was absolute, drawn not from a statute book but from a deeper, older well of justice. Defeated not by a bullet but by a simple act of a good man's conscience, Cain turned, his face a mask of impotent fury, and mounted his horse. The three riders retreated into the darkness from which they came, their hoofbeats a fading, angry sound, the final notes of a nightmare ending. Silence descended upon the ranch, profound and heavy, a blanket of relief woven with exhaustion. The threat was gone, but its ghost lingered in the chill of the night air. The next morning, as the first hesitant blade of light sliced across the dark plains, three figures sat on the porch: Elias, Maria, and the boy, leaning sleepily against his mother's side. They did not speak. There were no words for the journey they had taken, for the chasm of fear they had crossed together. The scars of it were still too fresh. But in the shared quiet, a new thing was being built, fragile and unnamed. It was the peace of survival. It was the warmth of a shared dawn. As the sun climbed higher, casting the world in a clean, golden light, the boy, now fully awake, pointed a small finger at a jackrabbit darting through the sagebrush. And for the first time in a very, very long time, a sound returned to the land that had nearly forgotten it. It was faint at first, a thing of pure, unburdened joy. It was the sound of a child's laughter.